The manhwa starts with a man saying that he knows that name very well. We begin to get a description of the man. He's uncontrollable, a sword master who never wants to leave his room, and he's a man out of his mind. He is Count Perdium's useless oldest son, Ghislain Perdium. We see the man he is fighting asking how he, the best knight of the north, was defeated by that garbage human being. Ghislain asks him if he finds it warm and cozy, saying he put a lot of money into making that trap. Ghislain walks out coldly and glares at him, asking if he likes it. His enemy says there's no way he's the garbage Ghislain Perdium, asking how he knew of his plans beforehand. Ghislain reveals he is not only aware of the plans and actions of his opponents, but he also has detailed information about their numbers, the identities of their spies, and who provided them with reinforcements. This implies that he has been manipulating events from the very beginning, suggesting that his enemies were never truly in control or secretive in their operations. The man gets angry, saying there's no way, and that he's always been a hidden ace card, asking how a useless piece of trash like him could dare to mess with him. He gets interrupted by a kick to the face as Ghislain tells him to shut it. Ghislain says, "Try invading however many times you want. I'm going to be the one to win the war every single time, without fail." He takes off his helmet and asks if his enemy knows why that is. He says it's because he has all the plans. The story then jumps to a year ago in the Lithuania kingdom, near the Perdium estate. Ghislain is looking at his shaky hand and asks what just happened. He reaches for his throat, surprised that he's alive. He says there's no way. Just a while ago, he was killed. We see his sword get sent flying through the air mid-combat by his enemy. He cursed his enemy, and we see him get cut straight across the chest, though he was already bleeding heavily. He falls to his knees, and a red-haired knight says, "This is how it ends, Ghislain Perdium, the Mercenary King, and one of the continent's 7 strongest men." He adds that Ghislain has lost to none other than one of the continent's top 7 noble knights, named Idun. He declares the war over and asks Ghislain Perdium if he has any last words. Ghislain expresses regret, stating that he feels no satisfaction and only laments being unable to complete his quest for revenge and wishes that Idun would die right there. Idun sighs, calling him arrogant, and says he didn't expect Ghislain to have been the oldest son of the fallen Perdium household. He recalls Ghislain leaving his family after his sister died. Ghislain asks how he knows that when he's from a different kingdom. Idun responds that, of course, he knows because he worked hard to track him down. Idun reveals that they were the ones who worked with the Delphine household to bring down Ghislain's family. Ghislain hears these words and realizes there were others besides Duke Delphine's household that planned his downfall. Idun places his blade to Ghislain's throat, saying there's no point in explaining further since he's going to die soon, and that he should just accept his fate. Ghislain yells, calling Idun a bastard, saying that he'll never forgive him. Idun responds that he doesn't care and swings his sword, cutting Ghislain's head clean off, causing blood to spray through the air. Ghislain explains that he was decapitated at that moment, yet here he is with his head still on his shoulders. He wonders if it was all a hallucination, as he now finds himself in his younger body. He wonders if maybe he was taken captive and used as a lab rat for the mages, thinking, "These arrogant bastards will regret keeping me alive." Somebody calls out to him, addressing him as young master. Ghislain turns, and we are introduced to one of the Perdium soldiers, named Ricardo, who says he needs Ghislain to come out because he knows he's awake. Ghislain instantly tells him to be quiet and puts his blade to Ricardo's throat, threatening to let him live if he answers his questions, or maybe not, and begins to release killing intent. Ricardo is confused, asking what's going on, saying this is crossing a line, and no means no. Ghislain sighs, wondering why Ricardo is reacting like that when he's being threatened. He asks Ricardo what he's talking about. Ricardo pushes him away, explaining that he tired himself out from his earlier tantrum and fell asleep. Ghislain, still confused, asks what he's talking about. Ricardo asks if he forgot everything after taking a nap, mentioning that Ghislain had been throwing a tantrum about how he was going to command the group to raid the orcs. Ghislain is baffled, asking what kind of nonsense this is. Ricardo insists that Ghislain needs to get his act together, as people are waiting for them. Ghislain asks where they are going, and Ricardo replies, "Of course, to the Perdium estate." Ghislain is shocked and grabs Ricardo's shoulder, telling him to say that again. Ricardo, confused, asks what's wrong, but Ghislain presses him further, asking if he means the fallen Perdium estate. We then see Ghislain looking over the Perdium estate from a cliff. Ghislain is surprised, saying, "It really is my house," and he wonders how it's still standing, as he remembers it being reduced to ashes in the past. Ricardo asks if he had a nightmare, remarking that calling his own household fallen is too much, and he would be kicked out if the Count heard that. Ghislain pinches his cheek to check if he is dreaming, but feeling the pain, he realizes it's real. He notices that he has a younger face, and his estate is in its original state. This leads him to believe that he has traveled back to the past, or perhaps to an alternate timeline. His younger self resented the household, and his immaturity stemmed from feeling inferior. As time passed, more people from the household avoided him. Unable to withstand the criticism, he eventually ran away from home. Several years later, he became a mercenary, survived countless battles, built up his skills, and made a name for himself. He returned to Perdium to make up for his past mistakes, but all that awaited him were the remains of his family's household. He lost everything, but right now, everything is still here. All the people he holds dear are still alive as well, that he begins to smile, saying he can't believe it, and wants to sing a song of joy. But it's too early to rejoice. He recalls Ricardo mentioning the raid on the orcs and realizes he can't forget that day. This is the day that most of the people in the raid squad will die brutally at the hands of the orcs. In his past life, he had followed the orc raid squad in an attempt to make a name for himself. At that time, the report said there were only 3 orcs, and he thought it would be easy for someone like him, who had no experience commanding a squad. But when they arrived, there were more than 20 orcs. Almost everyone ended up dying because he had been stubborn and wanted to command them all. He believes the orcs shouldn't be too difficult to handle since they don't have a clear strategy. The problem is whether his squad will trust him, as they all think he's a useless bastard. Suddenly, they hear something being thrown overhead as one of their defense fortresses is sent flying across the ground in front of them. Soldiers scream that the orcs are here, as they see the giant, reddish orcs charging straight in. Ghislain asks if the orcs arrived this fast in his past life too. The orcs are absolutely decimating them. I do not see them winning this. Plot armor needs to kick in because bro is about to die again in his second life. A man yells in panic, saying everyone needs to get into formation and not panic. The man is the raid squad commander, named Scoven. Orc swings its blade at him, and Scoven narrowly avoids it. He says they let their guard down and weren't prepared for an ambush, especially with way more orcs than reported. At this rate, we're all going to die, Ghislain suddenly calls out to him. Scoven turns, confused, and Ghislain warns him to watch behind as an orc is about to launch a surprise attack. Ghislain quickly dashes towards Scoven, grabbing his shoulder and throwing him out of the way of the attack. Scoven, confused, wonders why Ghislain is sacrificing himself for him, but he is mistaken. Ghislain stabs his blade straight through the orc's hand, cutting its arm and leg clean in half. Everyone is speechless as the orc screams and collapses, crushing the ground beneath it due to its massive size. Ghislain cleans his blade of blood, muttering that he guesses he can't use mana and wishes he had returned to the past earlier. He walks over to Scoven and asks if he is the commander. Scoven, still confused, listens as Ghislain demands commander's rights. Scoven, bewildered, asks what he's talking about. Ghislain insists he wants the right to command. Scoven, irritated, wonders what Ghislain means by the right to command, saying he knows Ghislain is an idiot, but to ask for this when everyone's lives are on the line is too much. He stands up and tells Ghislain he can't give up the authority that the Lord entrusted to him so easily. Scoven walks away, asking if Ghislain thinks this is some kind of game. Even if Ghislain is the young master, he cannot just hand over command like that. Ghislain mutters that this is annoying, admitting he would have reacted the same way if some fool had come up to him asking for command. Suddenly, another orc charges in to avenge its fallen comrade. Scoven tells Ghislain to fall back, saying he'll handle things. Did Scoven just forget what had happened moments ago? Ghislain sighs, realizing he has no choice. He raises his sword and throws it, almost hitting Scoven in the back. Scoven grabs Ghislain by the collar, asking what he thinks he's doing. Just then, he hears the sound of something getting stabbed behind him. He stops yelling for a moment, turns, and sees an orc with a sword straight through its forehead, towering above him. The orc grunts and falls backward dead. Scoven, stunned, wonders how Ghislain hit its weak spot. Ghislain calmly asks if Scoven knows what's most important in battle. Meanwhile, we see all the men trembling in fear of the orc's battle cries, hiding behind their shields. Ghislain says, "There's no hope in winning a battle when your troops are filled with fear. You have to gain momentum to win." Ghislain pulls his blade out of the orc's head and runs in, dashing through the debris of the tower. He leaps through the air, landing right in the midst of the charging orcs. He stabs one straight through the head, right in front of everyone. Scoven, in disbelief, watches as Ghislain pulls out his blade and taunts the orcs, telling them to come at him. Standing on top of the orc's head, he declares that he'll kill them all. The orcs charge at him, but Ghislain counters, cutting off one of their arms. He quickly dashes around that orc and toward the next two. He dodges the swing of one, then strikes both in the chest, eventually cutting off their heads. Scoven, watching in awe, wonders if he's dreaming. Even as a mana user, Scoven finds it hard to keep up. So how is this skinny young man doing all of this? Ghislain, starting to tire, acknowledges that he's clearly exhausted. However, he's using the smallest of movements to dodge attacks and relying on his expert swordsmanship to strike at the orc's weak points, like a manaless swordmaster, or perhaps something even greater. Ghislain yells, asking if this is all they have, saying he's not even warmed up yet and that they're not living up to their reputation as a warrior species. As he turns, the soldiers realize that all the orcs are charging at Ghislain, and they wonder if he's running away. The men then call out to Scoven, who stands there lost in thought, unable to figure out what Ghislain is thinking. Drawing the orc's attention was a good move, but running away toward that direction, Scoven recognizes it as the edge of a cliff near the Perdium estate. He begins to sweat nervously, thinking, there's no way. He yells at all his men to raise a shield wall and follow the first son in a battle. All the orcs charge behind Ghislain. He muses that Scoven has probably realized what his plan is, if he's any kind of skilled commander. Although Ghislain would prefer to cut all the orcs down himself, his stamina won't allow it. But this should be enough for Scoven to handle, he smirks. As the orcs push Ghislain toward the cliff's edge, they hear the sound of charging behind them. They turn to see Scoven and the other soldiers advancing with shields and spears. Ghislain grins, thinking, this is perfect, and then jumps backward off the cliff, shouting, now is the time. Scoven yells for the troops to push the orcs off the cliff, and the soldiers charge, pressing the orcs, who now have nowhere to go. The two forces collide, and the men scream as they push with all their might. The orcs, unable to resist, begin to fall off the cliff. Meanwhile, Ghislain has lodged his sword into the cliffside, hanging on. The orcs crash to the ground below, dying from the fall. The soldiers, exhausted, gasp in disbelief, saying they actually managed to kill all the orcs. Scoven, however, yells for Ghislain, rushing to the cliff's edge. He spots Ghislain still holding onto the wall, grinning. Scoven, surprised but relieved, smiles and extends his hand, telling Ghislain to grab it. But Ghislain, his strength fading, lets go of his sword and tells Scoven he can't hold on any longer. His hand slips, and he falls down the cliff. Neither Scoven nor anyone else expected this outcome. As Ghislain falls, he dreams of a little girl calling out to him. We learn it is his sister, Elena. He reflects on his memories with her, how she once thanked him, but their relationship had deteriorated as his attitude worsened. Eventually, she came to loathe him. In the dream, the memories appear as fragments, and he grasps one, saying these are his memories of Elena. He then hears her voice, and in the vision, she grabs onto him, pulling his arm with tears in her eyes, saying they should go together. Suddenly, his eyes open wide, and he finds himself staring at the ceiling, realizing he is indoors. He looks at his hands, surprised to find he's still alive. Looks like they actually managed to save me, he thinks, still wondering what that strange dream was. As pain shoots through his body, he concludes it must be the consequence of pushing himself to his limits. But it's at least a reminder that he's alive, that a woman opens the door, calling out to him, clearly relieved that he's awake. She carries a bucket of water and lets out a sigh, asking if he knows how worried she was. We learn her name is Belinda. She scolds him gently, saying she told him he should have let the soldiers handle the orcs. He jumps out of bed, hugging her tightly. She asks what he's doing and if she did something wrong. He says no, he's just glad to see her. We learn that she was his personal tutor since he was little. She was the only one who continued to stay by his side despite his idiotic antics. But after his family fell into ruin and she went missing, he never saw her again. He never expected to see her like this. She wonders what he's so happy about since they see each other every day. He realizes he needs to tell her the truth, so he tells her that a catastrophe will soon strike Perdium. She wonders what he is saying, and he responds that the truth is he died and came back to life. In a sarcastic tone, she says, sure, and I'm sure the orcs almost killed you. He tries to explain it to her, but she insists that he, rather than Perdium, is in greater danger. She continues to scold him, and he realizes this isn't going to work. She asks what he was going to do if he were too hurt to go to the festival. He then starts to recall it, and she asks if he's already forgotten, saying that Lady Elena has been waiting for the day to go to the festival with him. It would be a great chance for the two of them to become close to each other again. He now remembers the festival that always happens around this time of year, and he holds up a picture of him and his sister. He reflects that, in his past life, he didn't have time to enjoy these events because of his traumatic experience, and he asks how long it is until the festival. Belinda thinks about it, saying he has about a week left, and he can't believe it's so close. His sister asks if he's inside, and she begins to enter. He says the day is soon coming that changed his life, as it's a memory that continues to haunt him. When he looks over, we learn it is an event that will lead to his sister's death. Ghislain quickly hugs Elena, and even Belinda is surprised. Elena starts to get flustered, asking him what kind of prank this is, and he tells her that he's missed her. She shoves him away, saying that he's creeping her out, and he can't believe how strong she is. Belinda mentions that she asked Elena to come, wondering what kind of game Ghislain is playing, asking if he thinks this makes everything okay. He says he has no idea what she's talking about, and she reminds him that he told her to piss off because she was annoying and that he thought she was disgusting. He can't believe he said all that. He explains that he wasn't close with her in his past life and admits he was a complete piece of shit. He apologizes, and both Belinda and Elena are shocked. They ask if the orcs hurt his head, and he insists no, he dealt with them himself, wondering why they keep implying that he was the one who got hit. Suddenly, his pain returns, and he collapses to the floor. In a sarcastic tone, Elena says, "Yeah, right, you totally dealt with them," and both she and Belinda start laughing. He can't believe they're having such a wholesome moment. He smiles, thinking that everyone is the same as he remembers them. He wonders why his past self wasted so much time on useless things. The festival next week looms in his mind. In his past life, he rejected Elena's offer to go, using the excuse that the events of the raid squad upset him. That was the last time he ever saw her. Her body was later found shredded into pieces along with her guards, and he regretted that moment every day for the rest of his life. Someone knocks, asking if they can come in. It's Elena's guards, Jamal and Philip. She asks why they came in when she told them to wait outside. Jamal apologizes, saying the servants asked her to oversee their work on the festival supplies. Ghislain asks why they would even need Elena for that, and Belinda reminds him that he wouldn't know because he's always lazy. She asks if he knows there's a shortage of workers. He asks if it's really so bad that even Elena has to work now. He didn't handle these things back then, so it's obvious he wouldn't know that he tells his sister he would like to help her. She looks back at him in disbelief, and both she and Belinda are shocked. Outside, we see multiple vendors set up for the festival. Ghislain is yelling, saying that he offered to help, but Elena tells him to go away, explaining that people will be too scared to work with him around. She shoves him aside, and he asks if this is really how she should treat someone wanting to help. That he explains that her body was found near the slums, far from the festival grounds, and that someone must have called or forcibly moved her there. To prevent that, he needs to know the ins and outs of the castle. A man quickly runs over, calling out to Ghislain. Ghislain is surprised, and we learn that it is a knight named Fergus. He says that this lowly servant of his made his way over as soon as he heard about the news of the orcs. He begins to cry, and Ghislain says they can stop talking about it now. Elena laughs, saying it's great timing, and that Ghislain has been acting weird after waking up. She asks Fergus to take Ghislain back to his room. Fergus says, as she wishes. Ghislain remarks that it can't be helped, and he'll get to know what's going on around the castle better in the following week, that he mentions an abandoned training field in the castle, and tells Fergus to take him there. Fergus asks for what reason, and Ghislain replies, to train. What other reason would I need? Fergus is surprised but quickly guides him over. When Ghislain arrives, he can't believe how well-maintained it is for being abandoned. He notes that it's a perfectly suitable location for him to train at, and he never saw anything like this as a mercenary. Fergus explains that they kept it maintained in case Ghislain ever wished to use it, and he's certain what Ghislain is going through is just a phase of not wanting to train. Ghislain wonders if Fergus took this much care in his past life too, and he begins to truly regret how he acted. He tells Fergus that he needs to live a long life, as dying is hell. A pain. Fergus says it sounds like Ghislain has already experienced death, and Ghislain replies, as expected, you're sharp. I actually did die and resurrect. Fergus thinks he might have suffered brain damage. Ghislain then says Fergus can head back, and he's going to start training. Fergus tells him that he'll just wait outside. Ghislain always treated everyone around him like they were his enemies, but now he realizes he was just short-sighted. He reflects on how he only has a week to prepare. In his past life, it was revealed that the one behind Elena's death was a lord from a neighboring territory. Thanks to that, Perdium got caught up in a war that led to its downfall. Her death was essentially the starting point of his house's end. This means he needs to get things straight from here on out. First things first, he needs to improve his physique. It sucks that he doesn't have a lot of time, but he should at least be able to control mana. Mana is a supernatural resource that allows humans to break through their limits. Most people say that noticing and taking in the mana is the hardest part, but he was able to do that even on the battlefield. He has to connect the mana particles floating in the air and bundle them up as if he's spinning a spool. For someone like him, who has experienced thousands, no, tens of thousands of battles, creating a mana core is a piece of cake. But if it were just that, he couldn't have been part of the strongest 7 in the land without the method from that half-buried book he found. With the natural mana core of humans, he can actually surpass their innate limit by creating a second core, and even a third, stacking them on top of one another to create a connected mesh of multiple cores, resulting in an explosive force from his body. His nose begins to bleed, and so does his mouth. He says that 3 cores is his limit. We learn that he actually achieved 5 in his past life. This method allows one to create an explosive force in a short time, but it also requires an extremely large amount of mana in return. That was the primary reason he lost to Idun in his past life. Bringing a whole knight order to fight against him when he had already run out of mana left him with nothing to do in retaliation. He's confident he would have won if it had been a fair fight. Copium. He acknowledges that it's an inherently unstable technique, but this is enough for now. With his youthful body and plenty of time, he vows to enact revenge on Idun and on those bastards standing behind House Delphine who helped destroy his country. He promises to get revenge on every single one of them. A week later, on the day of the festival, there are fireworks in the sky. Ghislain is putting on his belt and filling his belt pockets before heading to the festival to meet with his sister. She is surprised that he actually came and asks what happened, saying he never used to do these sorts of things. He replies, "As a Perdium, I should at least come to festivals every once in a while." She tells him that he's been acting really weird recently and mentions that she's heard he's done nothing but train for the past week. He asks, what is so wrong about the next in line of a knight family training? She is confused, saying that he didn't care about these kinds of things just the other week. He was the one who said Dad was annoying and that he wished he was the Lord already. She laughs, saying that she likes the way things are now, and it seems like the oldham is back, and she smiles brightly. Ghislain looks over at her and says that he realized something in the past week. His actions have changed, and his perception of the future is slowly beginning to shift as well. The general flow of things might be the same, but it is difficult to gauge the impact of his actions on small events, some butterfly effect type of situation. Making good use of the information from the future is his job, and he needs to respond to each situation effectively. His preparations are now complete, so he starts to enjoy his night at the festival with his sister, and we see them trying some bread, and then she carries him to the next stall. This probably happened quite a few times, and finally she says that was a lot of fun, but it's getting a little boring with it being the same every year. She asks why there's nothing new. Ghislain says the festival is almost over, but nothing's happened, and he wonders if it's because he's with Elena. Jamal then asks if she wants to check out the other areas, and Ghislain thinks this might be it. He says, according to a friend of his, there are new events elsewhere, and asks if she wants to join. Jamal starts to take Elena away, and she says, this better be fun. Ghislain then says, it must have been these two, the traitors of his house, both Jamal and Philip. We learn that Jamal and Philip were the most trusted knights in the feud because they had protected Elena ever since she was a child. It was known that they were murdered while protecting Elena in his past life, but now he knows differently. He decides to follow them. Jamal says, now we're here, showing Elena an empty area in the slums. Elena looks around, asking what this is, saying there's nothing here, and questioning if they are sure there will be a performance in such a dirty place. Jamal looks nervous, saying he guesses they are not prepared yet, and thinks they will be here soon. She barks at him, don't make me laugh, and asks who would perform here. Ghislain looks around, saying as expected, this may seem like a simple deserted street at first sight, but looking at the placement of the obstacles blocking the escape routes, they must have made preparations in advance. Elena then starts dragging him, saying it's time to go. Jamal tries to tell her to wait, saying she should at least see the show since she's already here. She says no, she doesn't want to stay in such a filthy place. Ghislain asks if she works out or something, asking why she's so strong, which annoys her. Then Philip stands in her way, blocking her, and makes a very angry expression, saying they should wait a little more. She gets scared by him and says they are acting strange today, asking what's going on. Jamal says he's sorry, didn't mean to scare her, and that it's just that a reasonable request came in, as he begins to rub his hands together. She asks what he means by request. Then somebody else approaches with 2 men. His name is Frank, and he says, as expected, their work process is clean. Jamal says, of course, and adds that they brought the young lady as promised, so they should end the deal here. Frank then spots Ghislain, saying he doesn't think he requested him to be there too. Elena is clearly scared. Jamal says he'll hand him over for free, saying Ghislain foolishly followed them, not knowing this would be his graveyard. Ghislain calls Jamal out for selling them, asking if he really thinks he can get away with this. Jamal laughs, asking why Ghislain isn't worrying about himself instead, saying all they have to do is run away to a faraway place. They were getting sick and tired of this impoverished land anyway, and he's sure there are plenty of others leaving Perdium besides them. He laughs in a condescending way. Before Jamal can react, Ghislain swings his blade, slicing him across the chest. By the time Jamal realizes, it's too late. He begins to spit out blood. Philip also realizes they might have bitten off more than they can chew as Jamal's corpse falls to the ground in two. At the very least, the barbarians never sold him out. Ghislain glances back at Philip, unleashing his mana, and asks if he agrees. Philip grabs onto Elena, calling Jamal an idiot, asking, how could a knight lose to an amateur? Before he can even draw his blade, Ghislain's sword gets lodged in his head. Philip says, impossible, as his final words, and he falls backward, dead on the ground. The henchmen ask if that's really the eldest son of Perdium, saying they're sure he never had any combat training. Frank, judging by his appearance, says he's sure it is, although they were taken off guard. He adds that Ghislain instantly killed 2 knights with attacks that used mana each time. Elena hugs him while crying, asking what is happening. Ghislain realizes what he must do, and he hits her and knocking her out. He tells her to take a little rest, putting her to sleep on the ground. Frank thanks him for doing the work for them, saying he's much different than what they heard and that they were planning on taking care of those two themselves. He asks if Ghislain has been hiding his true skills. Ghislain asks why it matters to him. Ghislain realizes there are going to be 3 of them, but the 2 beside Frank are nothing. Since Frank exudes a lot of mana, he'll have to end this quickly. He forms his mana into strings around his hand and asks Frank, who requested this? Frank replies, is there a need for a dead man to know that? Ghislain says he knew Frank wouldn't say it easily, no matter what. The henchmen ask if they should cut Ghislain's head off, but Frank says no, they need to capture him alive and break every limb in his body so that he can't help but go mad. He adds that Ghislain has to writhe in pain for his shape to come out beautifully. What a freak. Frank's men launch toward Ghislain, but Ghislain pulls out one of the things he prepared from his belt, which is a candle, and he launches it into the air at them. It's a firecracker. One of the henchmen is taken off guard, but that's all Ghislain needed, as he instantly pierces through the firecracker, stabbing the man between his eyes, killing him instantly. The other man says, that was such a shallow trick, and comes in for a counterswing. Ghislain blocks it behind his back, then turns to look at the man, wraps his arm around his blade, stopping his movement, then rotates his hips, pulling it backward and instantly following up with a swing, cutting the man's head off. He then senses the next attack coming from above and blocks it behind his back again, which surprises Frank, as he didn't expect Ghislain to block in such a strange position. It was a perfect sneak attack, too. Ghislain then pivots off his foot, rotating his body and slicing diagonally upwards toward Frank. Frank narrowly avoids death, but loses his pipe and gets grazed on the throat, and his pipe falls to the floor. Frank follows up with an instant attack from above, and Ghislain uses both swords to block it this time. Frank says he's surprised, and if he had been lacking in mana, he would have been beheaded just now. Ghislain wonders how Frank survived a strike to his neck, saying maybe he focused his mana around his neck to reduce the damage. Frank says he has no clue how Ghislain learned such strange swordsmanship at his age, but that he's going to die here. As Frank begins to release his mana, he imbues it into his blade and charges for another attack, saying Ghislain can't beat him with such feeble mana. The force begins to push Ghislain back. Frank laughs, saying, you will die here. Ghislain grins, and Frank wonders what he's smiling at. Ghislain rotates his body, deflecting Frank's sword, and stabs his own blades into the ground. Using the swords for stability, he launches a nasty kick straight to Frank's face. This knocks Frank back a bit, and Frank says, I already told you it won't work with that amount of mana. But then, suddenly Frank starts spitting up blood and falls to the ground on one knee. He wonders what happened, saying the power of Ghislain's attack is different. There's no way he should be able to achieve this through his enhancement with his skill level. Ghislain says he never expected there to be a true culprit behind Elena's death, and he begins to unleash a red mana this time, saying that he's glad he now figured out who it was. He tells Frank to prepare himself as he unleashes his third core. Frank, surprised, asks how he could boost his mana so much, but Ghislain isn't here to talk. He's already in Frank's face with both blades. Frank says that he's fast and blocks the first attack, trying to backpedal, but before he can create any distance, Ghislain continues with yet another powerful swing. Frank manages to block this one, But Ghislain readies his blades, coming in for another big follow-up. This one sounds much heavier than the rest, and Frank's hands begin to shake, saying that his hands are numb from blocking Ghislain's strikes. His sword also begins to crack, and he says that no matter how much mana one draws, it usually has a limited effect. He's never heard of a method that increases mana so explosively like this, as if Ghislain has become an entirely different person. Ghislain is channeling the Mercenary King from his past life. The next swing of Ghislain's sword shatters Frank's blade, and we see Frank's fearful expression in the reflection. He then gets sliced across the chest and realizes that he's done for as Ghislain rears his fist back, coming in for the final blow, stabbing him through the chest. Frank begins to spit out blood, and Ghislain puts his forearm to his throat, pinning him against a wall, saying he'd like to finish their conversation before ending him. He asks Frank who was the one who requested this and begins to twist the blade in his stomach. Frank pulls out a hidden blade, saying he's not going to go down easily and that he'll at least take Elena with him. He flicks his wrist, going to throw the dagger, but we see mana strings wrap around it, and this is what Ghislain expected in the first place. He was ready for everything and says it's time to make a deal. Frank shouldn't try to say anything useless and should answer his questions, and then he'll sheath his blade. Frank says that he can't move because these threads are created with mana and wonders when this happened. He realizes it must have been from the start, understanding he's been played. Ghislain then says he's sure someone of Frank's caliber would know how to patch himself up, though that wouldn't matter if he destroyed his mana core. As he begins to imbue his aura into the blade, Frank looks down, scared, as he starts to feel a vibrating sensation in his stomach. His core begins to shatter, causing his mana to scatter. As we see this happening, Frank asks if Ghislain is out of his mind, saying one wrong move in the backflow of mana could cause an explosion and blow this whole area away. He asks if Ghislain is planning to self-destruct. Ghislain says that's for the unskilled and that he can manage it. Frank realizes that Ghislain is not bluffing and that he's serious as he sees the reflection of death in Ghislain's eyes. He screams, saying it was Count Desmond who requested this, and that he needed a pretext to start a war against the Perdium and Degarda families. Ghislain asks if that's so and realizes it now, saying in his previous life, such underground work was left for the families allied with the ducal house. He can't believe that Duke Delphine would do this without even trying to hide it, and he says now he understands why they wanted to kill Elena. Frank pants, saying yes, and then Ghislain shoves the blade completely through his stomach. Frank asks what he's doing, saying this is different from what Ghislain said earlier. Ghislain asks what's wrong, saying Frank has killed plenty of people in his time, yet he's scared when it's his turn. Frank begins to laugh, saying nothing will change even if Ghislain kills him. He's already finished the work for Degarda. He asks if people would listen to a punk like him and that Perdium will perish due to the war. Ghislain puts his hand on Frank's face, saying he'd like to tell him something. He says that he was reborn after dying, and he will make sure that it is different this time. He begins to twist his blade, completely shattering the core of Frank. At the same time, a firework is shot into the sky, and we hear it explode, as that is exactly what happened to Frank. He literally painted the walls. Ghislain begins to pant and looks around at all the corpses he left behind. He turns his head to make sure Elena is still asleep, which she is, and he sighs out of relief. He drops his blade to the ground, just glad that this is finally over. Then he begins to feel the recoil and starts to spit up blood, causing him to fall to the floor. He says exploding 3 cores wasn't an issue at all back when he was the Mercenary King, but he refuses to fall like this that he bursts into a nearby house. He recalls that in his previous life, they found another body besides Elena's, and according to what the guy said earlier about the Degarda family, there must be a clue under some debris. We see that it is none other than the son of Degarda, dead, and it seems he was killed along with his escort knight. This is how they silenced them and framed them as Elena's killers. The moment this is revealed, the war will start. He decides to hide the evidence by pulling the firecracker out, burning the place down, saying he will not let it happen as planned. He leaves carrying Elena while somebody watches from the treetops, vanishing instantly after witnessing it all, though we then jump to someone saying it was a failure. We see the person who vanished, and they're all talking, saying they sent guard knights as well as Frank, the best they have, yet they couldn't take care of one girl. They ask if they let their guards down because they thought it was easy work. The person in the middle says it was all due to Ghislain Perdium. They ask how that makes sense, saying that Ghislain is the useless bastard of the north, and they're sure he's well aware that Ghislain is a useless piece of shit, asking if he's really trying to use him as an excuse. The person sweats nervously, saying that Ghislain was completely different from the information and rumors they have about him. He describes the brutal murders that Ghislain committed, as well as how skilled he was at defeating all of the enemies without wasting any of his movements, and how he was always a step ahead of them, as if he was a completely different person. But they've already taken care of things with Dagarda, so it won't be an issue to start with. They start flaming him, saying that he couldn't even find out information on one kid, asking how much of a setback this was. They all yell, saying that this guy needs to die right here, and now one person speaks up, calling them all noisy, and the room instantly grows quiet as they all look up at a throne. The man in the middle says that he will personally get rid of Ghislain Perdium. When asked how, he says that he will make a duel happen naturally, and there is someone he has in mind. When they all ask who, he says it's somebody named Cain Logus. He's famous for his strength-based swordsmanship despite his young age. He's the epitome of strength. He confidently tells them that there is no one in the north who has a match for his strength. Plus, Cain is Ghislain's cousin, so it won't be too forced to have them meet. The man on the throne says that if he fails again, there will be no next time, and his bloodline will end with him. The man says he will not disappoint him. Back at the training hall, Fergus enters, telling Ghislain that it's approaching mealtime. As a string of aura flies past him, grabbing Ghislain's sword handle off the wall, he looks at it, and it begins to fly straight back toward Ghislain. He catches it in his hands, blows his breath, and starts swinging it around, saying that should do. Then he spots Fergus, who says that he can't help but feel so focused on his training, asking what he did just now. He sees Ghislain's sword dangling off the thread, and he's using mana like a string. In his past life, Ghislain used it all the time, but at his current skill level, he needs to employ his core to use it like he used to. Due to his lacking mana, however, if he just makes one thread to use less mana, he can still have it despite having less. Fergus says he thought he had trained his mana for a long time, but he's never seen anything like this. Just a while ago, Ghislain didn't use mana, let alone train, so how was he able to come up with an idea like this? Ghislain cuts his thoughts short, asking if Fergus wanted something. Fergus says he just wanted to stop by to tell him something, and Ghislain asks what it is. Fergus bows, saying he wanted to thank him for protecting the young lady. Ghislain asks why he's thanking him, saying it was something he should have done naturally, and they should go eat that a few days later. The festival was paused, but it only made sense as a guard knight tried to traffic the young lady. We see her sitting in her room, pouting and asking why everybody thinks she's lying when she tells them Ghislain was the one who saved her, and that Ghislain should go say something to them. Ghislain says it's fine, as they won't believe him anyway. Belinda is just pissed that Jamal and Philip tried to get rid of her, calling them perverts. Ghislain says they're just happy that Elena lived, saying he's able to stop the war from happening, but he's sure they won't give up, and he can't stop them on his own forever, so he needs to grow a military force. Another maid enters the room, bringing food, and Ghislain gets ready for his meal, saying he has to get more into politics to do that we see a single piece of bread on the plate, and Ghislain looks down, confused, asking Belinda why they are only getting desserts. She says surely he didn't forget how the situation was. We then hear somebody screaming, "Compensate!" out the window, and it is a big chungus of a villager, saying they need to be compensated for the damages caused by the cancellation of the festival, and they're barging at the gates. It's a bunch of villagers. The guards try to get them to calm down, and Ghislain looks out the window, asking what's going on. Belinda says she knew this would happen, and surely he knows that their county is full of merchants who make a living from the profits that come from the festival. It was good enough for them last year, but since the festival was canceled after only one day, it makes sense they are upset. Ghislain didn't think that their county situation was this bad, and he says this isn't good. They will only get more aggressive if he doesn't do anything. He asks Fergus what the soldiers are doing, telling them to go calm the crowd down. Fergus says they don't have any. Ghislain asks what he means, and Fergus says that most of them have been dispatched to the Forest of Monsters, where the orcs came from, for reconstruction. Because of the raid, Perdium is basically eternally at war because of the barbarians in the north, and on the other side, there is the Forest of Monsters from where the orcs came from originally. Ghislain clicks his tongue, saying they have no money or soldiers, and this is a mess. He tells Belinda he would like to have a private conversation. He says she's the one who manages his money and that they should use that to calm down the merchants. She laughs, saying there isn't any, and he asks why not. She reminds him that the count cut off his allowance because he spent money like water. He can't believe he's broke and tells her to lend him money. She tells him she doesn't have any either. Ghislain sits by the window saying, "Damn it, I have no money or soldiers," and that he pretty much has nothing. Without even the least amount of money, there's nothing he can do, even if he has knowledge about the future. He needs to get his money up. He wonders if there is no way. There's surely something on the estate that's worth a lot that we see Ricardo after a while, calling out to Ghislain. He asks why he's here in such a hurry, and Ricardo says that there is a problem. Young Master Kane wishes to meet him. Ghislain is surprised, and we see Scoven, all beaten up, only to catch another punch straight to the face, with a follow-up to his armor, causing a huge dent in it. Scoven begins to spit out blood, landing directly in front of Ghislain. He begins to cry while calling out to Ghislain. Ghislain looks pissed, and Kane says, "There he is." Ghislain looks up at this absolute behemoth, and Kane looks down on him. Bro has some serious shit-ass face. If you watched till the end, comment part 2 to let me know. Subscribe for more videos like this. Leave a like or a comment to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.